Welcome, everyone. Thank you for attending our education book discussion with Adam Kissel, Rachel Alexander Cambre, and Madison Marino Doan. I'm Shannon Watkins, Research and Policy Fellow at the James G. Martin Center for Academic Renewal. The Martin Center is a nonprofit organization dedicated to excellence and accountability in higher education. Our work shines sunlight on and provides solutions for the most critical issues in higher education. You can find out more at jamesgmartin.center. Thank you to our viewers and donors for making events like this possible. Although this event is free, we appreciate those of you who made voluntary contributions. Your work makes our work possible. The Martin Center's education book discussions are quarterly online events with authors of recent books about higher education or related topics. Today, we're going to talk about the pressing need to reform curricula at America's leading colleges and universities, one of the Martin Center's ongoing interests. Specifically, we'll be hearing about how students with prudence and persistence can still receive a meaningful education at these decaying elite institutions. I'll hand over the floor shortly, but I want to take 1 minute to tell you all how this event will run. First, the authors will talk for about 45 minutes about their book. Then they will take questions from the audience and from my colleague, George Leaf. Viewers on Zoom, you can post a question by using the Q&A icon at any time. And viewers on Facebook, simply post your questions in the comments section and we'll be sure to monitor those as well. Also, we are recording this event, so you can watch it later or share it online. We'll be sure to send you the link as soon as the video is posted. Again, thank you for being here and for supporting our work. The book we're talking about today is Slacking, A Guide to Ivy League Miseducation, which was published in May of this year. In the book, the authors provide detailed information about the coursework offered at Ivy League colleges, including Harvard, Yale, and Princeton, with the goal of helping students make good curricular decisions. It also highlights the pressing need for reform at these institutions. The authors are Adam Kissel, Rachel Alexander Cambre, and Madison Marino Doan. Adam Kissel is a visiting fellow for higher education reform in the Center for Education Policy at the Heritage Foundation. Rachel Alexander Cambre teaches at Louisiana State University and Franciscan Missionaries of Our Lady University in Baton Rouge, as well as for Belmont Abbey's online master's in classical and liberal education program. Madison Marino Doan is a senior research associate in the Center for Education Policy at the Heritage Foundation. Adam, Rachel, and Madison, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Shannon. It's a pleasure to be with everyone and with you. Maybe what we should do by way of introduction is start talking about what a college education is for and what general education is for. And that gives us some of the background for talking about what's working and what's not working in the general education part of the Ivy League's programs. So maybe you think college is about having an exciting time at the football game or about getting a job, but the traditional model of what higher education is for is to prepare you for adult life, to be the kind of human being and citizen who is an adult who's doing something more than just a high school diploma holder who has been trained to just take their place in society. The higher education graduate, in contrast, has been taught to think for themselves in a different way, to say, maybe I'm going to end up with the same views of the culture that I grew up in, but I know those views and have them as my own and in a deeper way. Or maybe some of the views that I would have changed, and maybe there's some things we could change about our culture. And I've thought for myself, and I have my own ideas about what's right and what's wrong and what to do. So in that context, colleges have generally decided to break up their curriculum into three parts. There is a general education or a core curriculum that is what I just talked about, what every educated person should know and be able to do as a well-educated adult. Second, they have electives uh, where they're going to follow their dreams and study whatever might be interesting or seem valuable to them outside of the general education. And then what you might call a concentration of courses, or what people often call a major, where they specialize in some more particular thing that, as they say, you could know everything about something and something about everything. The major is the everything about something, but only really at the bachelor's level. So you don't really know all that much, but you've taken some courses and you have a deeper understanding of math or your particular area of science, or of the humanities or the social sciences in a particular area. So that's the way we can approach what's going on in higher ed in general. And the Ivy Leagues are no exception to that. Brown is a little bit of an exception because they have no core curriculum. They have a completely what they call open curriculum. The other Ivy Leagues do, however, break into those three parts. There's a gen ed or core curriculum, there's majors, and there's electives. And what our book is talking about is just the gen ed piece of that. So what does a college do to you starting at age 18 or so, leaving you somewhere around age 22 modally, and somehow they've made you into the person who's ready for adult life in a different way than someone who just has the high school diploma. Well, what they do is they say, well, I guess you need to learn a little bit about everything. So we're going to have some humanities, we're going to have some social sciences, we're going to have some hard sciences, maybe some ethical reasoning, maybe some quantitative reasoning. And if we are serious about that, we're going to give you what we think you ought to know and be able to do in each of those areas. So maybe that's Western civilization, maybe that's US history from the colonial era through the founding era to contemporary issues. And in the sciences, maybe that's core knowledge in the sciences. That's if you're doing it right. If you're doing it wrong, you say, you know what, we have a ways of knowing approach. Any history is as good as any other history. Any literature is as good as any other literature. Even the phone book, if you teach it well, you can really learn important things from the phone book. Just looking at last names and thinking about the sociology and the geography of human relations. Rather than saying what we need to do is prepare you for life with what Matthew Arnold in a famous essay called the best that has been thought and said in the world. And a college that is being paid $80,000 or $90,000 a year by the taxpayer or the student's parents or some combination should be doing what Matthew Arnold wanted you to do. It should be providing you the best that has been thought and said in the world. Instead, the ways of knowing or distribution requirement approach will say, here's 500 courses you can choose from. Any of them count for your humanities requirement. Here's 200 social science courses. Any of them count for your social sciences requirement. And as a result, students get no focused idea of what they ought to know or be able to do intellectually. Instead, they can think a little bit like a historian. They can think a little bit like a social scientist. They can think a little bit like a scientist. And that's the fragmentation and almost anarchy, I would say, of the core curriculum in higher ed today. And it's worst of all in the Ivy League. So I'm a trustee at the University of West Florida. At West Florida, just like in the rest of the state university system of Florida, there's a pretty narrow set of courses that count for your gen eds, for your core curriculum. But at a place like Harvard, the courses are tendentious, they're question begging, they can be self-indulgent, they can be very narrow. So you could have a course that's about spells, witchcraft spells to summon witches and demons, and that's going to meet your humanities requirement at Harvard University, right? Or at Princeton, you could have a course that's just about shoes to meet your social science requirement. They call it Get Your Kicks, because it has to be attractive to students. So those are the kinds of courses we're talking about. And I don't want to go too far into the details because I think Rachel and Madison will have a lot more details to give us from the chapters that they know really well and the schools they know well. But that's maybe a good introduction to what you would do if you did things correctly. And then we'll hear probably soon about all the ways that that vision is not exemplified throughout the Ivy League. And the last thing I'll say is that, as Shannon noted, in every chapter of our book, we go through 8 chapters for 8 different Ivy League colleges. We provide a slacker curriculum. So if you wanted to be the best slacker you could be, here's what you would take. All the worst courses in the categories I mentioned. But if you wanted to be a striver, what you would take is still possible to give you that kind of Matthew Arnold greatest works of Western civilization and other civilizations. And so we offered that curriculum as well, just as snapshots of being able to see the difference. So with that, I'll hand it to Rachel or Madison.
Thanks, Adam, and thanks, George and Shannon, and to the Martin Center for hosting us. It's a pleasure to be here. I wanted to sort of introduce my interest in this topic by way of my own educational experience. So I had a very fairly mainstream high school education experience, which is to say that I didn't get a classical education, but I got enough of an education to know that I wanted to study the liberal arts in college. I loved literature, I loved math, I was fascinated by history, so I gathered that a liberal arts education was what I needed, and I chose to attend a small, high-ranking liberal arts college on the East Coast. I gathered that this would give me the kind of education I needed. And in many ways, it was a wonderful experience, but when I arrived, and went to sign up for my first semester of classes, I realized I wasn't really sure what to take. There were so many seemingly good options. And I knew I wasn't in the best position to judge which of them to prioritize. So I turned to the general education requirements. And my alma mater, like many schools, embraces the distributional model. So instead of requiring certain courses, as Adam mentioned, students are simply asked to take a handful of courses within a few broad subject areas and proficiencies rather than a core set of courses. So these general education requirements didn't really give me the kind of direction I was looking for. Luckily, I did find my way into an Intro to American Politics class with a professor who ended up becoming my academic advisor. And I brought to him my quandary. I knew I wanted a broad liberal arts education, but I didn't know what I didn't know. And he really steered me in the right direction. And in some cases suggested classes that I would have otherwise overlooked. I would never have considered. And here's the key. He didn't just recommend political science classes. He recommended courses across the board. So he advised me to take this art history course taught by a renowned expert in Renaissance and Gothic art. He advised me to take a classics course on ancient Rome. He advised me to take a course on Lincoln's rhetoric with one of the foremost living Lincoln scholars, and so on. Basically, he gave me what general education requirements are supposed to provide. They when I'm speaking about general education requirements, sometimes, we are talking to audiences that aren't really familiar with them, which makes sense because a lot of schools have abandoned them. So I like to explain them as they're grounded in a simple but today contested idea, which is that there are certain things that every educated person ought to know, and that it's a university's job to first define those things and then teach them. So these requirements will naturally vary some across universities, but as Adam explained well, their purpose is to ensure that no matter what major you choose, no matter what electives you take, you will graduate with the basic scientific literacy, cultural literacy, numeracy, communication skills that are necessary to be an educated citizen. And our book contends that when universities abandon this crucial job, they fail their students. So given this background, when Adam proposed a project investigating the general education requirements at each of the 8 Ivy League universities, I was very interested. These universities serve as models for higher education in America, for better or for worse. So if you're interested in reforming higher education, as we all are, it's important to know what the Ivies are teaching. So the way we went about this is the three of us divided up the 8 Ivy League universities, and we each went ahead and combed through these universities' course catalogs, which are all available online. So you can access the titles and descriptions at least. And in most cases, who's teaching the course, but it's hard to know exactly how they will teach it. But you can at least find the course titles and course descriptions of all courses within a university's catalog. So we went about it this way. Now, most Ivies, as Adam mentioned, have adopted the distributional model, and that means there are a lot of courses to go through. So Yale, which is one of the courses one of the universities I wrote a chapter on, listed for the fall semester 2024, 751 course listings to fulfill the humanities requirement. Now, there were some of those courses that were cross-listed, so the number might be something like 600, but it's still an awful lot of courses to be considered a requirement to choose from. So this is the first, our contention is this is the first way that Ivies invite students to slack off. They've given up on actually requiring particular courses that teach particular content. But when we actually started going through these options, we found things are worse than that. Because once we dug into these hundreds of courses, we found that there were few that were actually poised to provide a general education. So an optimistic interpretation of the distributional model would be, well, maybe some universities just have so many good courses that transmit general knowledge about major works of art and literature, key scientific and mathematical concepts, influential philosophic ideas, and that's why they've opted for the distributional model. This would be great news if this were the case, but our research revealed that things are quite the opposite. So we went through each requirement and highlighted the worst courses offered, what we dubbed the slacker courses, as well as the best offered. Because our purpose in writing this book is not just to highlight the bad, but we are interested in helping students to choose well and pointing the way towards reform. So I would like to just to open up, give you a glimpse of what we have in the book, offer a little overview of the 3 universities I wrote my chapters on, I studied. So I did the chapter on Yale, the chapter on Dartmouth, and the chapter on Brown. And I found that the slacker courses offered at these schools tend to fall into one or more of 3 categories. So the most common type of slacker course I found, and I mean, this is applies to the other universities as well, pretty well, are courses that advance a blatantly ideological agenda. And what we mean by that is that these course descriptions assume answers to fundamental questions about justice, about equality, about human nature, rather than asking those questions and asking students to wrestle with them in the course. There are so many examples of these, it's really hard to count, but we found a lot of courses on settler colonialism, on intersectionality, on the existential threat of climate change, in which the goal is not to ask how climate change is occurring or whether it's occurring, because there's not scientific consensus there, but to assume the answer. A couple quintessential examples of this: Yale offers a course that's titled Managing Blackness in White Space. Brown offers a course on how to teach U.S. history to high school students through an LGBTQIA lens. So these ideological courses make up a lot of the slacker courses we found. But the second most common type of slacker course we found are those that focus on completely non-academic topics like pop music and reality TV. A quintessential example of this type of course would be Yale has a course on pop sapphism, which is a course on lesbianism and pop culture. One of the things, the course description, one of the aspects or phenomena studied, according to the course description, is the conspiracy theory that Taylor Swift is a closeted lesbian. This is in a Yale course that can be taken for general education credit. So there are a lot of courses like this that really focus on pop culture. Brown has a few, has one on contemporary Black pop music. Dartmouth has one on the pop art of food. So a lot of these courses are just on like very clearly fluff topics. And then lastly, several of these courses err in being just extremely narrow and niche, focusing on a highly specialized topic that might actually have academic value, but doesn't contribute to a general education. So think, specialized research topics that a professor might be writing a book on. The professor teaches a class on this. So there's a German course at Yale that's on the German cultural history of paper, which might be academically interesting to study the Gutenberg press and the development, the influence of it on cultural history, but it certainly doesn't provide broad general knowledge. Another example would be Dartmouth has a film course on television history in the United States. I will note that we found that the STEM courses at these universities do fare much better. So this is more of a problem in the humanities and social sciences than in science, technology, engineering, math. But even there were some problems. So Yale offers Asian Americans and STEM as a course that can be taken to fulfill the science requirement. It doesn't appear to be a science course. It's a course on the history of Asian Americans in STEM. You can also at Yale take a course on vaccine attitudes. You can take a course on the politics of HIV and AIDS. So there are also, we're seeing some of these problems creep into the sciences too, but it's not as pervasive. I'll just close with saying that this doesn't mean that you can't get a good education at these universities. That's part of what our book's purpose is, to help. So Yale offers a series of directed study seminars that offer first-year students an intense interdisciplinary introduction to some of the great books, the seminal texts of Western and Near East cultures. Dartmouth does something similar, offers a humanities sequence for first-year students that can fulfill their writing requirement, and students read from Sophocles, Shakespeare, Tolstoy, Nietzsche, Hawthorne, etc. And Brown has some good options as well, although Brown has very little in the way of requirements. There's only a writing requirement for students. So things are not all lost, but our takeaway was that it has become increasingly difficult to find good general education course options at these universities. It shouldn't be that hard to find a course on Shakespeare among hundreds available to fulfill humanities and arts requirement, but unfortunately it has become so. So I'll turn the floor over to Madison to talk more about her experience.
Thank you, Rachel and Adam, and thank you, George and Shannon, for inviting us to be a part of the webinar. It's been great to be part of it. So just wanted to give a little bit of background of how I got involved in the project and then my specific 3 colleges that I reviewed. So I attended for college a medium-sized public university in Texas named Lamar University. It was named after the 2nd president of Texas, Mary B. Lamar. And as you're probably familiar, that Texas does have general education requirements for all of their public universities in Texas. So this usually includes like composition, US government and history, math, and a science requirement. So by attending this public university, I did take some of the kind of these basic courses that gave me a basic understanding of some of these areas of study. So I was a part of the Honors College at Lamar, which had some additional kind of requirements, but I still would say it was not similar to a lot of the traditional liberal arts core that so many universities are famous for. So it's because this was something that I was not exposed to at Lamar. Once I moved to DC after college, this was something that I was really looking for. So upon arriving, I took a class at Pepperdine at their DC campus on kind of politics, policy, also gave some information related to like first principles and intellectual and moral formation. And then after continuing that class, I participated in a couple of different fellowships that kind of taught me more about some of these ideals along with the founding ideals of America, which was extremely influential in my early time there in DC. And then after taking a job and role at Heritage, met Adam. He, after working together over the course of a year or so, he approached Rachel and I with this project. Initially, we saw it as just a heritage report. This is something we were going to do, just a review of the general education requirements at all of the 8 Ivy League institutions. After Adam, and he'll probably share this later, first reviewed Cornell and was shocked with what he found. And so I agreed, knowing that, based on what has been going on with higher education and as a new scholar, reading about what has been documented by National Association of Scholars, ACTA, organizations like yourself, the James G. Martin Center, and thought that it would be a really great project to collaborate on the time. To give a little bit of context too, is my husband was deciding on whether or not to attend Harvard Business School. And so I had a personal interest in understanding what the requirements were going to be, even though he wasn't going to be studying at the undergrad level. Still, we were going to be going into the Valley of the Beast. I wanted a better understanding of what the Ivy League was going to entail. And also at the time when we were completing this project, we had 2 interns as part of our Center for Education Policy that were both from Harvard and Princeton. So I was eager to get their perspective on their own experiences navigating the general education requirements, especially as conservatives at the institution. So first, Adam charged me with putting together a general framework of how we were going to approach this project. Again, we intended it to just be a heritage report. We didn't know that Encounter would later take an interest in making it into a book. So thank you, Encounter, for doing that. But so I began reviewing all of the general education requirements on the websites of each of the 8 Ivy League institutions. And then, as Rachel indicated, we're then looking for the publicly available course catalogs at each of those institutions. And while we were going through each of those course catalogs, we knew that we couldn't review the syllabi because they oftentimes weren't featured within the course catalog, but we were able to get a decent understanding of what the course was going to entail based on the course catalog description. And also sometimes they would include kind of the assigned book list with the courses. So then we decided to break up the colleges into our respective areas. So Adam took Cornell and Columbia, I took UPenn, Harvard, and Princeton, and Rachel, as mentioned earlier, took Dartmouth, Yale, and Brown. And so what I found about Harvard, Princeton, and UPenn was, one, that there was a lack of requirements relating to American history or Western civilization. This was something that really stood out to me, especially as there are many organizations like ACTA and others who have studied this for much longer. But just to give you a little bit of context into what I found is that while UPenn does have a history and a tradition general education requirement, they have no requirement to learn American history or the history of Western civilization. And there are not even many choices for students who wish to do so, who wish to have a greater understanding of American history. Even there was a class called Deciphering America, but it only focused on a few telling moments in history and definitely did not give you a complete understanding of our nation's history. Harvard does have a history, societies, and individuals requirements, but many of the courses were hostile to American civilization, narrow, or unlikely to represent diverse viewpoints based on my review. There was even a course in 2023 I found it was titled Race in a Polarized America, which wondered if the US at its core is a white supremacist society. Good options to fulfill that requirement were also limited. Princeton does have what's called a historical analysis requirement, but there are nearly 100 courses available to meet this requirement, and many of them overlap with courses listed in the other distribution areas. Students, I did find at Princeton, could take a class called Introduction to the Classics or the Roman Republic, but they could just as easily swap that class out with Understanding the Recent Queer Past or Magic and Witchcraft in the Ancient World. Something that also stood out to me about Princeton was their writing seminar requirement. There were over 37 different courses that could basically fulfill the writing seminar requirement at that time. But in our Striver list for Princeton, I recommended to hope for a good course to become available later, because what was available out of the 37 courses was not great. Some of the courses included Assigned at Birth, How Gender is Taught, Embodied, Resisted, Redefined, and Policed. Another course was titled Bad Botany, where students will research a plant of their choosing in the context of a specific colonial or climate justice movement, economic project, or colonial encounter. And then one last course was called Sexual Revolutions, where students will investigate the perpetual tension between cultural evolution, institutional status, and we do so by exploring some of the most cherished parts of our personal lives, gendered identities, and sexual intimacies. So those were just some of the takeaways that I had when I was reviewing Harvard, Princeton, and UPenn, along with some of the other things as Rachel and Adam have described earlier. So just a flag, Heritage, among other institutions, has long been concerned about the state of higher education and families not knowing what their options are or what is actually going on in these colleges and universities. So in addition to the book Slacking that we put together, We Hope Families Read, last year our team launched what's called Choosing College with Confidence, which is a guide to empower families to make informed decisions about colleges and universities. We launched our first edition last year, which granted nearly 300 colleges and universities one of 3 designations, either being a great option, worth considering, or not recommended. For our well-rounded educations, we gave we gave those colleges a green rating. For those who were deemed yellow, we would say those are somewhat rigorous institutions with individual colleges focused on civics or other academically challenging departments within a university. And then our red rated institutions were those that suppress diverse viewpoints and lack a strong academic core. This year, we expanded our guide to almost 1,000 colleges, which covered 3 times the number of schools as last year's report, including some of the largest colleges in the US. If you go to the Heritage website and you type in choosing college with confidence, you'll be able to go directly to the guide and be able to see our detailed methodology, which included over 20 different data points that we pulled from to put together what are our green, yellow, and red ratings. So we hope that that guide, along with our book Slacking, are an essential resources for families with high school age children that are considering what looks next for them.
So that is our set of presentations. George, if you have some comments or questions for us, or if the audience also does, we'd be glad to talk more with everyone.
Very good, Adam. I'll have to say I pitched right into your book as soon as I got the review copy, and enjoyed reading it. There was quite a bit of eye rolling and a few laugh out loud moments at some of the courses you described. Let me start with this question, and I'll try to get questions from the audience too, so they don't have a chance. Here's one of mine, though. Many of the courses you've written about seem obviously to be just pet projects and complaints by the professors who teach them. Now, how does this happen? Are college leaders unwilling to say no to proposals to teach such ridiculously narrow and obviously biased courses? What's your take on that, Adam? And of course, let's let your co-authors speak about that too.
Certainly. I think there's a certain economics of course approval where the core departments that you would think would be responsible for the core are getting lots of students coming and getting students in seats. And then the music department says, hey, why don't we have a core course too in the humanities? And then a far-flung department might say, well, wait, why don't we get a course too? And then the architecture folks say the same thing. And so they all scratch one another's back and say, look, we're just doing ways of knowing here. We've just got distribution requirements. Sure, everybody can have a chance to get some people through the core curriculum requirements to get some enrollments. And a lot of colleges too will say, it doesn't matter if it's really core knowledge or not, but it's the intro course for the discipline, and that counts as gen ed enough. And of course, geography is just as good as every other subject. So let the geographers have a core course too. So it's almost an economics and sociological situation, certainly not starting with a vision of what an educated person is and then filling in the details, which would be the way that you ought to do it, but much more crass kind of log rolling.
Yeah, I'll just add, I think part of the unwillingness to say no to these course proposals is an aversion to what might come across as elite, which is saying, well, no, there are actually some things that every educated person should know. And that means there are some things that aren't essential for every educated person to know.
Good point.
If I could just add also, George, I think it has to do too with the incentive structure to achieving tenure. I think oftentimes those who want to achieve tenure are going to focus on faculty research and publications and not on teaching kind of those core and introductory classes. And so I think you see kind of, and Rick Hess said this in a recent article that was published through AAI, but he said, generally faculty aren't hired, recognized, or promoted for their teaching anymore. And I just think that's just a really important thing to consider when we're looking at what's being offered at the campuses.
Thanks to each of you. Here's a question from someone in the audience. Did you use AI to complete your study?
No, we did not.
No. So
No.
when there's hundreds of courses available in a subject, that meant whoever was responsible for that chapter and that subject read through the course descriptions of all of the courses.
More than once.
And right, because you want to select for the best and worst.
Mhm.
And as good as AI is now, it's not a well-educated person. It doesn't know how to distinguish in the same way that I think and hope that an educated person does the wheat from the chaff. And we were not simply hoping to titillate the audience and make them laugh, but also, or make them cry, but really set out a standard for what's the best of Western and other civilizations.
Thank you, Adam. Let me ask you this. At the schools you've covered, writing courses seem to be especially bad. Now, how did English departments become so dysfunctional with the emphasis on ideology rather than learning about great books and how to write well in the English language?
I was an English major, so maybe I'll go first. I had a decent experience in the early 1990s as an English major. And at that point, the postmodern movement was still taking over. And the race, class, gender, which later became race, class, gender, and sexuality turn in literary studies was also pretty well represented, but had not fully taken over. So, but by today, those attitudes have taken over. The idea that, as Rachel said, if you're studying Shakespeare instead of the phone book, you must be an elitist. But if you're studying race, class, gender, and sexuality, you are at the cutting edge. If you're talking about the center and the margins of society, you're doing sociologically important things. You're becoming an activist for social change. And that's the point of being an English professor. And since English departments have the responsibility for the writing department or the writing requirement, those kinds of biases made their way into something as basic as fundamental skills of critical thinking and reading well in order to write well. So it's the ideological turn in English departments, along with other disciplines, that has ruined the writing requirement as well. No longer do they say rhetoric and dialectic are what you're supposed to do in a writing course.
Yeah, I also wonder how much the decline in literacy among students factors into this. And it's hard to know what comes first, lower educational standards at the college or high school level versus a decline in college readiness. But I noticed that a lot of the writing course topics and descriptions that we read through don't have course texts. This is not a course in which students will be reading. It's a course in which students might be watching videos or reading texts or blogs, not your traditional kind of literature course. And the writing assignments also are not traditional writing assignments. So it might be to write, a blog post about yourself or to write a series of tweets. So I wonder how much of this is because increasingly you hear that students and we all are, Adam and I are in this position ourselves, teaching students who don't come to college capable of reading Romeo and Juliet or reading the Iliad or reading even a contemporary novel. And so I wonder how much that is playing into this watering down of the writing courses in particular.
If I could just add also, I think the problem that we are describing is prevalent outside of the Ivy League, and Adam and Rachel kind of alluded to this also, but there was a study from the American Council of Trustees and Alumni from 2015 that found that less than 8% of the nation's top universities require English majors to take a course focused on Shakespeare. And then in the report also, they said that many colleges are downplaying the classics in favor of survey courses that introduce various styles of thought, such as Duke's Creatures, Aliens, and Cyborgs class. So anyway, I just thought that was an interesting finding on their behalf, and just thought it was an interesting way to describe what's being happening outside of even the Ivy Leagues, what we looked at. Let's
turn to another question from one of our listeners who writes, One of my most challenging courses in college had a fluffy name. The course name and its description were designed to encourage enrollment and achieve that goal. Did you do any direct primary analysis of the rigor of such courses? Can you offer evidence that a course on sapphic pop or witchcraft necessarily lacks rigor?
I think that's a great question because actually one of my favorite courses in college was called the Political, Social, and Party Animal. And so it's sort of a, catchy title that caught the eye of, was intended to catch the eye of students. But when you looked at the course description and the text read in that course, we read Adam Smith's Theory of Moral Sentiments, Jane Austen's Persuasion, Tom Wolfe's I Am Charlotte Simmons. So there were some serious text included in the course that you could catch right off the bat. Unfortunately, the courses we've looked at, we don't have access to the syllabi, so that would be ideal. All we have access to are the course descriptions, but the course descriptions do list, if not all, then the most important texts that will be read in the course. And I, for one, would have been thrilled to see that the course on pop Sapphism is a course in which students read Sappho. That would be great. But that was not the case. This is a course in which students are reading lyrics of Taylor Swift songs and watching movies with Kristen Stewart and other lesbian pop culture figures. So that's where we're getting our analysis of the rigor from, is from the course descriptions, which usually detail what text will be read and what questions will be examined.
I would add that the best books that are part of the great conversation, especially in the Western tradition, the great ideas, naturally have a rigor to the text themselves, that if you read them carefully, the books help you read better and think better just by going through the exercise of getting to know what the author said, and to some degree what the author thinks he or she is doing. This is why I said, yes, you could have a serious, rigorous course on the phone book and make it work somehow, but there's not a great author of the ages that is trying to help you become a better person by reading that text. So there's a natural rigor just by looking at the books that are being taught. And again, I think it's important to remember that a narrow course that would be great for a major or a PhD class might be good in itself, but that's not the only criterion that you need in a gen ed course.
All right, let's turn to another question from a listener who writes, 4 decades of educational assessment has convinced me that there's a huge difference between what is taught and what is learned. This project seems to assume those are the same. Isn't this a problem?
There's a joke about higher ed, which is another crass joke, which is that we will pretend to teach and you will pretend to learn. We get our paycheck, you get the piece of paper that says you sat in class long enough to get it, and we're all going to be happy. And this is related to the question you asked, George, about professors who are just teaching out of the small number of things that they study rather than the things that are best for the student. So it is a problem. Students are studying less than ever. They come in less prepared than ever. I think I saw a study that the average IQ now of a college student is 102, meaning there's a bunch of folks who are far below that who are trying to get college degrees. And you have to teach to the students you have, unless you're Harvey Mansfield and you say, gosh, all you folks deserve C's and D's, but Harvard won't look kindly on me if I do that. I guess you all got A minuses. The gentleman's C is now the gentleman's A minus.
Yeah, I think it's a fair point that the question's making about the difference between what's being taught. It doesn't necessarily correlate to what students are learning, but for the purposes of assessment, that was what was available to us to look at what is being taught. And that certainly matters. Even if you have really good students who are eager to learn and are self-motivated, if they're in a class in which there's not much demanded of them, why are they paying $80,000 a year to sit in these classes? So that's sort of what the question we were interested in is. These universities are presuming to provide this education, and not just to give 4 years for students to self-explore. And so are they doing it?
Here is another question from one of our audience members who writes, I have extensive experience with the undergraduate curriculum at Columbia. It's well-known core curriculum that is required of all entering undergrad students. How does that curriculum fare in your analysis?
Columbia for 100 years has, on paper, pretty much had it right. So they have the advantage of being in New York City. So when they study some of the classics of Western civilization, they can also go to art museums and see art and sculpture that is part of the same era and is some of the best that has been created by human minds. So they talk a great game. They have great books across their civilization type courses in literature, in history, and so on. But Columbia is like everywhere else, and there are faculty members who aren't satisfied with that. So a couple of, call them DEI requirements, have sneaked in along with all the rest. And so you can imagine that in our chapter on Columbia, we also, we focus pretty heavily in the slacker part of the curriculum on the many courses in those newer subject areas, if that's what you want to call it, that are not good. And then the second problem is related to what we said about the last person's question, which is everything can be right on paper, but if you have graduate students or professors who don't like Western civilization or America in the first place, but they're there to study whatever their graduate studies are, and they have to teach in the core, they're not going to teach it very well or sympathetically. Now, the students are still getting exposed to the great works, which is better than taking the course on Bad Bunny or the course on Beyonce, right? Even so, it's not being taught sympathetically. So the same graduate student might be out protesting against Israel in the afternoon, but in the morning she was teaching classics of social and political thought. And for the purposes of our book, we weren't able to get that level of detail to look at, say, the course reviews of that particular course and that professor and see, well, what is that course really like? But on paper, Columbia still is at the standard in a pretty healthy way.
Thanks, Adam. Another question from one of our listeners. Many courses are taught by multiple instructors. Aren't differences within these courses at least as great as differences between them?
I don't know if that's true or not. So the best subscribed course to meet one of the science requirements at Cornell is a course called the Solar System. There's only so many different ways you can teach the solar system, I suppose. And considering there's about 25 sections worth of Cornell students taking it, it's probably not as rigorous as most of the other science options. So one thing you can do at most of the colleges is see how many sections there are of each course and get a sense, or at least using that as a proxy, of how popular that course is. Now, since we're talking about the Cornell science requirement, I've got to mention probably the only really bad and unsuitable course in the sciences to meet your science requirements at Cornell is a course where you watch Disney movies about animals and you compare those depictions of animals to real animals. So there's the science. And you say, well, Dumbo, the elephant, doesn't really have ears like that. Or, the Lion King lions don't really look like that. Here's what a lion really looks like, right? And then you pretend you're one of the animals in animal society and you try to solve social problems together as the community of animals. And one student said, that lion was so upset he couldn't eat the mouse, but we were so glad that he wouldn't, right? And that passes for a science requirement at Cornell. And the Alumni Association at Cornell was so proud of it that they did a whole article about how great this course is and how interesting and avant-garde, I guess it is. But to tell the truth, as Rachel said, pretty much all the rest of Cornell science courses to meet the science requirements are good and rigorous and fine.
And I just want to throw out again, that's $80,000 a year to take a class on Disney movies. To the listener's question, we wish we could have looked at syllabi. We also wish we could have looked at and gotten to know each of the instructors who teach these courses. So certainly that's relevant. You might have a course that looks like it has a great syllabus or a great reading list, but if you have an instructor who's not committed to the course or who just isn't committed to teaching well, then the course is going to be much worse than one taught by an instructor who is a seasoned teacher. But that's just something that was beyond the bounds of our research.
One thing I'll add, when I was teaching in the first year human being and citizen class at University of Chicago, which is one of only 6 choices at the time that you had in the humanities to meet your core requirement, we had a weekly meeting among all of the section leaders. We had maybe 8 sections, and the senior professors who had taught it for decades were there with me, little graduate student, and we talked about how should we teach Moby Dick? How should we teach Aristotle's Ethics? How should we teach the Iliad? And that was fantastic for, those of us younger scholars, but it also gave us a lot of uniformity across the different sections so that the course could be as good as it deserved to be for the students.
I had a similar experience teaching at UVA. There were 3 of us teaching the same course, and we met regularly to ensure consistency.
Well, here's a question from Jen Robinson. Did you examine the processes each university used to choose which courses would qualify for general education credit? Did any stand out to you as either better or worse?
Love the question. We did not do that. Pretty much every university's faculty senate will develop a curriculum committee, which will be mostly faculty members, maybe have the dean of the college or a divisional dean on it. And you have to get your syllabus through, as well as your topic through that committee, as well as probably your disciplinary home in order to be able to teach in the core. I'll just give one footnote, which is of interest given some free speech background that I have. At a place like Harvard, the undergraduate Faculty of Arts and Sciences, there's also a graduate school of arts and sciences, but the undergraduate FAS controls the document that is the undergraduate curriculum, the course catalog. And it doesn't matter what the administration wants, what the central administration wants. If they think a course should be in or out, they will have a vote of eventually the whole faculty senate of the FAS to decide what gets in the Harvard curriculum and what doesn't. And so as a result, there's this drag queen whose name is Lahore Vagistan, who is not, I don't know if he is teaching in the core or not, but he got into the Harvard course catalog to teach RuPaul's Drag Race. And that's a Harvard course. And I think the Faculty of Arts and Sciences just wanted to stick it to everybody criticizing them and say, this is what we teach and why, because we can.
Another question from the audience. I attended a military academy in the 1960s. The courses I disliked the most, but came to value later in life, were the 10 courses in engineering. This academic division seems to be absent from nearly all the curricula now. This deficit seems to have been ignored by most current scholars. Any comments about engineering?
I'm sorry, I'll go again if that's okay. So in the Harvard experience, once again, there was no undergraduate bachelor's degree in engineering until the 1990s. And their argument was, we're still a liberal arts college within a big research university. Engineering is too technical and pre-professional. We're still calling ourselves a liberal arts college. Eventually that broke down and engineering came in and was a major that you could choose. But it took 350 years before that happened at Harvard. So I would also say that when we looked, say, at Cornell, there's a whole separate engineering school separate from the Arts and Sciences College at Cornell. So that if you're going to become an engineer, you're going to do something rigorous and hard, and you're even in a whole different college at Cornell that is giving you a different education your core curriculum requirements are different. And so there's a sense in which that just didn't play into our Cornell chapter because we just looked at the Arts and Sciences College.
But I will add that several of these schools have engineering courses listed as options to take under either the science requirement or the quantitative reasoning requirement. So they are present as options, and we consider them good options for those requirements. But no, there certainly are no specific engineering requirements for these general education courses.
I mean, when Columbia still has a course called Rocks for Jocks or Physics for Poets, I forget which one they still have. The idea is that they know what kind of students are coming in and what they can actually expect of the majority of their students.
Let me ask you this question. How would you recommend that a student or parent evaluate any college or university that they're considering? Not just the Ivies, but in general. What should they look for? What are the red flags?
Especially after conducting this study, I think it's more important than ever to go. College visits are more important than ever, and not college visits to experience the campus life, which is what a lot of students want to experience when they're in high school and visiting colleges, but to go sit in on as many classes as you can. That I think is going to give the best picture for what the academic experience is going to look like, what the academic expectations will be, what students will learn. So that's what I would recommend for both parents and students. And it's most schools will permit parents of applying students to do that as well.
If I could just add, Rachel mentioned this on a previous podcast that we were a part of, but she said that students should kind of abandon what we've called as like the prestigious and elite colleges, and they should look more towards just overall quality, and there will be like that intellectual moral formation that families and probably students are also looking for. So I would say, one, do that as she's recommended, and then two, so I mentioned that Heritage has our Choosing College with Confidence guide. There's also several other guides out there, such as like the Manhattan Institute just put together a review. There's the Newman Guide, which looks at Catholic colleges and universities. There's the retired or the ISI Guide, and then also ACTA has a great resource. What would they learn? So there's several resources for high school aged children, and then also families to be able to look at.
Okay. Here's another question from a listener. If I were to give you the title of a course, would you list it under Slacker or Striver? And the title, James Baldwin and William F. Buckley, Two Perspectives on America. What do you think?
I love that title. So it's two perspectives, so you can put them in dialogue. There's enough high quality writing by Buckley that you can make that rigorous and serious. It's not simply ideological question begging. He's one of the greats, and if you're watching some of his debates, you can make that very serious. And then Baldwin is one of the great American authors, so it would make a really nice pairing. I'd still want to look at the course description and see what they do with it, but on title alone, I'm happy.
Right. That's just what I was going to add is titles can be misleading, as we found by reading these course descriptions. So it's helpful and very important to go ahead and read what the description of the course is.
Another question. How can there be curriculum reform and increased ideological diversity when most faculty are concentrated at one end of the ideological spectrum?
It's a very hard question to answer strategically. I get asked that fairly often, including just yesterday by a faculty member at a college I know pretty well. And you need leadership at the top of the administration and probably the trustees as well. And you probably are not going to have that at a number of institutions that have been similarly lost or broken. So if you look at Harvard's Board of Overseers or corporation, it's unlikely you're going to get relief from that level from those folks. It's disappointing, but this is why so many reformers say, start new institutions and start over. Go to the University of Austin. But what other states have done, North Carolina, Texas, Ohio, Florida, have used legislation to say the core curriculum must have this in it and must not have that in it. And at a high enough level of abstraction that it's not telling the professors what to teach and certainly not how to teach, but it's getting the core in there. And so Florida, for example, said, as good as sociology might be or might have used to be, it just doesn't count in the core curriculum anymore, except for intro to sociology, and maybe not even intro to sociology anymore. So if the legislatures come in, they're not going to do it as well as the faculty themselves, if they were being fair and honest, would do. Outsiders are not going to be as good as the peer reviewers on the inside. Trustees, same thing. Academic administrators, same thing. But the higher levels will have to do it if the lower levels refuse to do it or do it badly.
I'll just add that I think the importance is not, I do think it's important to have some, to have ideological diversity at universities. But I would almost say more important than that is to have professors and scholars who are committed to free inquiry themselves. So you might have an entire faculty that leans left, but if they're all committed to free inquiry, then that shouldn't be a problem. They shouldn't be bringing that into their classroom teaching or letting it bias their teaching or their assessments of students.
That's well said, Rachel. So one of the great stories from Alan Charles Kors, the very conservative Penn historian, is that he was in a course with a Marxist who made him read Hayek as the alternative. And that's what is an important part of what launched him on his academic career as a conservative.
Adam, I'm so glad you brought that up. I was thinking of exactly that same point that Professor Kors made. As I recall, what he said is after the students had turned in a set of papers, the instructor, who was definitely a man of the left, said, "You're all just trying to tell me what you think I want to hear. So I'm going to assign you a book that I don't necessarily agree with, but I want you to write something that shows me you understand his point of view." Too bad we don't have more professors like that any longer.
That's true. Another story is about an arch Aristotelian named Richard McKeon, a philosopher at Chicago. And when he taught Plato, there's this idea that the Platonists and the Aristotelians don't get along and have whole different ways of doing things. So to be called a Platonist because you taught a Plato course and teach him so sympathetically and well, but to be an Aristotelian is the kind of pedantic University of Chicago joke that I like to tell.
I had
Well,
a
good.
similar, yeah, I had a similar experience in that I had a professor who was an agnostic, agnostic/atheist, but knew that I was interested in religion and advised that I read St. Augustine, St. Thomas Aquinas, these kinds of books that were not, he was not suggesting because he was Catholic, because he was Christian, but because he knew it would be good for my education.
Here's another question from one of our listeners, an intriguing question. Might it be possible to design a higher learning experience without courses? Any thoughts on that?
Love the creative thinking. So right now, when you talk about micro-credentials, I say micro-credentials already exist in colleges. They're called courses. And they're called the individual papers and competencies you get across from one course to the next. So it doesn't have to be that way. So you could take a year-long investigation. I'll talk about University of Chicago once again. So you have to kind of separate up the time in some way. But if you read a great book really carefully, maybe you're done in 4 weeks and then you're done. Maybe it takes you 2 semesters or 3 quarters to read through the whole book of Genesis very slowly and carefully, and then you feel like you know it pretty well. And because the course, and the course credit are what we talk about as the credential, we say, okay, I guess that's going to be X number of weeks, and we'll call that course Genesis. But it certainly does not have to be that way. What Chicago did, starting, I think, in the 1930s, is said, if you pass some entrance exams, we don't care how old you are. If you're 16, you're admitted. And if you take our exit exams the next day and you know what you need to know to be a college-educated person, we graduate you the next day. And that's the kind of model that we should think about Did you come in where you need to come in? Did you exit where you need to exit? Doesn't matter to how you break it up as a course. Love the question.
Where my mind went with that question, but maybe this is not really what the listeners is getting at, is St. John's College, where there are courses, but they're really just reading lists, and there's not a professor necessarily lecturing on the text, but just sitting in the background guiding discussion about the text, which is not the traditional course experience at most colleges.
Here's another good audience question. I fear that we don't have professors any longer, only activists masquerading as professors. The emphasis isn't on developing the students' minds, but pushing doctrine. What is the solution? If any.
Go to
ahead, Adam.
Heritage's guide and choose a different college. The hard thing to do is that you get lured in. So you need to take Rachel's advice and sit down on some classes and find out if you're going to be bamboozled or not. But if you choose well and you end up at Hillsdale or Christendom College or Southern Wesleyan University or University of Austin or a small number of other colleges, you're going to be fine almost no matter what you take. And if you go to Harvard, you're going to be in trouble almost no matter what you take. So the way you solve it on the consumer side, on the client side, is to choose your institution well. Okay? We're not going to reform all of higher ed. $30 billion a year, 20 million student a year industry.
It's worth noting that there are still some outstanding professors at these Ivy League universities. Professor Robert George's course on civil liberties at Princeton is one of the most popular courses there. Emily Davis, who just translated the Iliad and the Odyssey, teaches Greek tragedy, Greek epics, classics at University of Pennsylvania. So I would advise, inside and outside of the Ivy League, if you're adamant about attending a prestigious university, then do your research as to what classes to take and what professors to take, because there are likely some gems that you might not know about. It might take some digging.
And I think there are several different types of societies at institutions like Harvard that have recommended reading lists. So in addition to taking a look at our book, like if you're deciding to go to one of these institutions, I would just recommend looking at one of the societies that have some of these recommended lists. I would also encourage, we highlight in our Choosing College Confidence Guide, there's a college called College of the Ozarks. It's also known as Hard Work U. And it's because all students work on campus to help pay for their education. So just another kind of great opportunity to not incur a lot of the student debt that students are constantly talking about and being able to just pay outright for your education.
I don't remember if Madison, you mentioned the Cardinal Newman Society of Catholic colleges, but for Catholic students, that's probably your go-to guide.
Let me ask you this. Have you had any particularly good or particularly bad responses to the book?
The reviews have been very kind. So I've been pleased to see the reviews. The one bad comment was, usually a bad comment about an author's book is, why didn't it cover X, Y, and Z? And then the author says, well, we did A, B, C, D, E, F all the way through W, and now you're complaining about X, Y, and Z.
We've also had good feedback from some smaller universities who are interested in reforming their general education requirements. And so we've had some interesting conversations with administrators about how to go about making just small incremental changes. It's hard to do a wholesale, replacement of general education requirements. It is a political process at these universities, but that's been a really nice fruit of the book.
We would love to be able to get our copy of Slacking in front of many of the boards of trustees that sit at these institutions. So just to give them a better idea of what's going on if they're unaware at their institutions.
I think they're probably very unaware. Having been a trustee now at a couple institutions, you often get what the institution wants you to get. and it's hard even to ask the right questions to get the information you want. So if you want to know what the curriculum really is and you're a trustee, you need a book like ours that addresses your college.
Thank you, Adam. Well, we don't, oh, wait a minute. We do have one more audience question. FIRE's recent survey on free speech seemed to show that the liberal/conservative ratio among students provided a good prediction on free speech. Those that were near 1-to-1 seemed to be much more likely to have high free speech scores than those that were in the 5 or 10-to-1 likely to suppress free speech. Any thoughts on that, Adam?
Campus culture matters, and the personnel establish a kind of ideology or culture of the place, which makes its way into college admissions. And the college admissions office says, oh, you Turning Point USA founder at your high school, I don't think you're a good fit for our New England bubble liberal college. And so the polarization gets worse and worse to the point where you're at a place like Sarah Lawrence, where you get Sarah Lawrence if you're too conservative and you get excluded and ostracized. So I think these themes all fit together: the curriculum, the campus culture, the free speech climate. And this is again where you need higher level administrators to say, if we don't want to be that way, we need to take some real action to change the culture of the place. And that's going to take years, decades. You don't just flip a switch.
Yeah, this too, I think, is where course content can play a role. So the course title that was suggested by an earlier listener, Two Perspectives on America, James Baldwin and William F. Buckley, these kinds of courses where you require students to take a side on something that is maybe not their opinion of it, could go a long way in increasing free speech and decreasing the self-censorship that we know exists at a lot of universities. Students may technically have the freedom to say what they think, but they feel like they can't say what they think because of what their peers might think or their professors. So really bringing that kind of debate into the classroom and making students partake in it, I think could be a remedy.
Here's another question. Do you have any suggestions about how best to credential faculty to teach an interdisciplinary core? Campus administrators tasked with meeting accreditation standards often seem to pour cold water on these efforts. Thoughts?
It's a hard one. Accreditors tend to be concerned with inputs and not with outputs or outcomes. The exciting developments that we've seen in the last couple of years with new accreditors, including the 7 public university systems that have gotten together in the Southeast to focus on colleges that will have standards towards high quality outcomes, that's all very exciting to me. What they might choose to do is include some kind of credentialing for undergraduate teaching that the way accreditation works, it's better not to impose it, but to say a college must have high quality standards for its undergraduate teachers, and it will assess them and credential them to make sure they're ready for those classrooms. I don't see that probably at the accreditors that I've looked at, but I would be excited if that came in from that direction. But it doesn't have to. It could come in from the state university systems. It could come in from senior administrators. And quite a miracle if the faculty themselves say, you know what, we need to demonstrate that we're good at teaching before we actually go into those classrooms.
Well, we don't have any more questions in the queue. So I think at this point, I'll say thank you to Adam, Madison, and Rachel. Enjoyed the discussion. Enjoyed your book. I hope it gets a lot of readers. And this is the last of the Martin Center's book webinars of the year, but we'll have another one coming up in the early part of 2026. And I invite you to keep an eye out on our website for whatever that's going to be. We don't know yet. But thank you all for your participation.
Thank you, George.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.